everybody. Welcome to our second webinar for today with Leon Cyao. And the topic of our webinar is what are gambling-like loot boxes in video games and how should they be regulated? Hi, Leon. How are you? Can you tell us some more about you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently working as a PhD fellow at the IT University of Copenhagen. My background is in law, so I mostly focus on looking at how gambling and also mostly how gambling-like elements in video games are regulated in different countries. So that's what you'll be hearing about today in this particular session. Awesome. Should I get started then?
You can start it, yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So yeah, just to start with a brief introduction of what these loot boxes are in video games. I've put a screenshot there on the right for you to look at. This is an implementation of loot boxes in a quite popular game. You'll see that these are products inside video games that players can purchase with real money. And what's important about these and how they're different from other in-game purchases that you can make is that the rewards that you get from these loot boxes are randomized. With other in-game purchases that you can make, you know exactly what you're getting when you spend money. But with these, you don't know what you're getting until after you spend your money. And you see there at the bottom of the screenshot there that the most desirable, the most valuable rewards are the legendary items. And only 7.4% of the time will you get one of those. So players would inevitably have to buy multiple of these loot boxes to try to get the legendary items. Now, some loot boxes are can be obtained in video games for free without having to spend any money. But we tend to focus only on the loot boxes that you do have to spend real world money to buy, because we think these are more obviously potentially harmful, just because they do have that monetary spending element. Now, to many people, these products are conceptually very similar to gambling, because the player is spending real world money and putting that into a randomized process through which they can win or they can lose. And most of the time they will lose by obtaining a reward that they don't actually want. Quite importantly, loot box purchasing has been found to be positively correlated with problem gambling. I'll delve a little bit deeper into that particular relationship in a little bit, but it's good to have that in mind as one of the headlines. And of course, finally, that these mechanics have been very controversial in video games, both amongst players and with policymakers and regulators, because they are so gambling-like, but they are, of course, available in video games that are deemed suitable for everyone, including very young children. Now, here is a video of what it looks like to open a loot box. It's actually in a screenshot I can show you. You see that there's a lot of sound and very exciting animation coming out. Now, this particular loot box is not very good. This is the worst result that you'll get, but most of the time, this is what you will get if you open a loot box in this game. But there's also this second video. I don't know if you noticed there, but the second reward is the legendary reward. Now that's the one that shows up 7.4% of the time, and you notice how the animation, the sound have both changed to sort of make you more excited about it. The sound was louder. There were more bright lights to make you more excited about this particular second opening of a loot box. But of course, this one occurs much less often than the first one. Now, how prevalent are loot boxes inside video games today? So we looked at the situation amongst the 100 most the video games that make the most amount of money on the iPhone platform in the UK. And in 2019, it was found that about 60% of them had loot boxes in. We looked at the situation again, and we found in 2021, and we found that 77% of the video games had some sort of in-game purchases that have randomized results. Now, the second study used a broader definition of what a loot box means. So part of that increase is due to that broadening of the definition. But we did also see video games that did not used to implement loot boxes start implementing loot boxes from between 2019 to 2021. Of course, unfortunately, we haven't done any research in Bulgaria looking into this particular issue, but looking at the games that are most popular in the country, I'll say that the prevalence rate should be quite similar to this. We do see a similar trend in European and North American countries. So why is loot boxes potentially concerning? Because we had these reports of individual players spending quite a lot of money on them. I've tried to convert the amount of the money into the Bulgarian currency. I hope I got it right. If it sounds absolutely ridiculous, then I must have gotten it wrong. But hopefully it makes sense. But we've had one player report that they spent £700 in just 1 month. We've also had situations where one player has spent over $10,000 in over 2 years in just one game. And we also have reports, probably more concerningly, of young people, children, who spend quite a lot of money in a very short period of time by using their parents' credit card information without any sort of permission. And what's quite interesting about that last story is that those children didn't actually get the rare item they were after, because even spending that amount of money wasn't enough. That's just how rare the item that they were looking for was. Now, we know from UK research, because it seems that most of the research has only been done in the UK, but the gambling regulator in the UK does an annual survey of young people and how much they participate in gambling. And in 2019, it was reported that 23% of 11 to 16-year-olds spent real money to purchase loot boxes. And this sort of prevalence rate has stayed consistent in 2022, when it was reported that about 24% of 11 to 16-year-olds are buying loot boxes with real money. Now, this is not engaging with loot boxes because they earn them for free by playing the game. This is when a child has actually spent real money to buy loot boxes. Of course, the sort of engagement rate of getting loot boxes for free would be a lot higher than this. And that's also reported in the survey, I believe. Now, the potential harms of loot boxes, I think, can be summarized into 3 different types. The first being that there is this structural similarity, this conceptual similarity between loot boxes and gambling. To many people, I think it passes the duck test. I'm not sure whether the duck test translates in Bulgarian, but in English, it's if something looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. A loot box, to many people, just feels like gambling. The second concern with loot boxes is that we know with traditional gambling, of course, there are these biases and fallacies that someone who participates in gambling will fall into. The gambler's fallacy, for example. We know that similar effects like the near-miss effect is also implemented in relation to loot boxes. We have research with traditional gambling saying that those things are harmful. They lead to products that are more addictive, but we don't yet have research about how they affect how someone purchases loot boxes, but we do know that they are implemented. And then finally, there's this empirical link between how much someone spends on loot boxes and their problem gambling. Now, I'll delve into that a bit more now. So this is this relationship that was first found by Zando and Karens back in 2018, where they found that the more severe a participant's problem gambling was, the more they spend on loot boxes. So there are at least 3 different explanations for this, and we don't know which one is correct yet. The first being that people who have developed gambling issues outside of playing video games, they already have them, would spend more money on loot boxes. This will suggest that consumers who are more vulnerable than your average consumer are spending more money on loot boxes. The second is that people who purchase loot boxes are developing problem gambling. Now, this would suggest then that loot boxes are causing harm. And then, of course, there are also other explanations that there is some sort of risk factor, and then loot boxes are just more interesting to a certain type of people because of, again, perhaps the structural similarities between loot boxes and gambling. We don't know which direction this relationship is in yet. However, more recently, we've had, within the last year, 2 longitudinal studies published on loot boxes and gambling. And they found that amongst young people in both Canada and also in Spain, those who bought loot boxes were more likely to participate in traditional gambling 6 months later. They were also more likely to spend more money on traditional gambling 6 months later. So again, it does not indicate that loot boxes are necessarily causing harm, but I think it's fair to say that the same group of potentially vulnerable consumers are attracted to both products. And it's concerning because these products, these loot boxes inside video games, are accessible to young children in comparison to gambling, which of course is available only to adults. Now, even though there is this correlation between loot box spending and problem gambling, we still don't know whether loot boxes are causing harm in practice, and there is a mixed literature on whether loot box spending is linked to worse mental health. Now, in relation to psychological distress, we've had one paper report that loot boxes appear to be disproportionately purchased by people who are experiencing severe psychological distress. And again, this would suggest that a particularly vulnerable group of consumers are spending more money on loot boxes. However, we've also had another study saying that there is no evidence of any association between loot box spending and worse mental health. And in fact, the most recent study that my team very recently published, we actually found a very weak positive correlation between loot box spending and mental well-being. And we also found that psychological distress actually negatively predicted loot box spending. Now, those are very surprising results, and I would suggest that we definitely need more research to understand what's going on, because although loot boxes are similar to gambling to many people, there are very novel and interesting aspects about them, and it appears that the risk and sort of protective factors for loot boxes are different from those from traditional gambling. We can learn from the gambling literature, but we still need to do new research on loot boxes to really understand what's going on. Now, that's sort of the psychological side of loot boxes. From now on, I'm going to talk more about how the law has decided to deal with loot boxes and how the product has being regulated in different countries. Now, I mentioned earlier, of course, that too many people, loot boxes just feel like gambling conceptually or psychologically. But how gambling is defined in law is different from how people understand what gambling means in common language. But this is somewhat of an oversimplification, but in most countries, in law, something needs to satisfy 3 different criteria before it will be gambling within the meaning of the law. The first being that there must be a stake. So whoever participates must put some money into the process that they will risk losing. The second element is chance, that this whole procedure involves some sort of randomization. Now, with loot boxes, we're not concerned about these 2 elements. The loot boxes that you didn't spend real world money to purchase, it's not gambling, where we're not really very concerned about it from a gambling perspective. And then secondly, there is this chance element. If a loot box does not involve randomization, it's not a loot box. So again, the first and the second elements, they're satisfied in all cases. We're not concerned about those. What we are stuck on is this third element of prize. In most countries, something is not gambling unless the prize is real money or it is something that can be transferred into real money. With most loot boxes, that particular element is not satisfied, because when someone buys a loot box and they get rewards, those rewards are stuck with their user account. They can't transfer them to someone else. So because the rewards that have been obtained from the loot box are stuck with the user who bought the loot box, the rewards are not transferable and they're not worth real money, and that's why they cannot be gambling within the meaning of the law. I've read one article, I think by a law firm, saying that the position in Bulgaria is the same as this. Most loot boxes are not gambling within the meaning of the law. Now I'm going to move on to 3 case studies about how different countries have decided to regulate loot boxes. The first being Belgium's attempt to entirely ban the mechanic. The second being the requirement for video game companies to make so-called probability disclosures in China and also the UK and many other countries. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the loot box presence warning labels that's been implemented in North America and also in Europe. I'll explain what they mean when I get to them. But first is this attempt in Belgium to ban loot boxes. You remember that just now I was talking about all three elements of gambling. Those three things apply in most countries, but they don't in Belgium because in Belgium, gambling law is drafted differently. So that third requirement about the prize being worth real-world money, it doesn't exist. Instead, gambling law in Belgium simply says that the player needs to experience a gain or a loss of some sort. It doesn't need to be monetary. And that means that the Belgian gambling law, and so has the regulator said, all loot boxes that the player spend real-world money to buy are randomized and provides rewards that are good or bad are illegal gambling because they satisfy the conditions for gambling, and also because video game companies cannot obtain a license to offer loot boxes inside video games because this is not a category that can be licensed by the regulator. So unlike in most other countries where I've talked about how the prevalence rate of loot boxes will be about 75%, maybe even 80%, in Belgium, we should see that loot boxes are no longer existent amongst the most popular video games. The prevalence rate should instead be 0%. We know of some companies that have reported removing loot boxes from video games to comply with the law. Good. We've also heard about some companies deciding not to publish certain games that must rely on loot boxes to monetize, or they've since removed those games that they used to offer in Belgium in order to comply with the law. Again, good. But the question I had was, can I still find loot boxes in Belgium despite this law, because we don't know whether every company has complied yet. So what I did last year was I flew to Belgium, and that ensured that Belgian law actually applied to me because I was actually inside Belgium to do this particular study. I played the 100 games that were making the most amount of money in Belgium, and I found that 82% of them were still offering some form of loot box. So clearly the law has not been complied with, and the regulator has not enforced the law. Now this really challenges whether other countries can regulate loot boxes in such a restrictive way, because for example, on the Apple platform alone, we have over 1 million games, and a gambling regulator, a traditional gambling regulator, is of course not equipped to be able to deal with all 1 million games. I've suggested that perhaps platforms like the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store need to enforce the law indirectly themselves, because they're in a better position than the gambling regulator to actually do it. But anyway, here are two screenshots showing you what it looks like to buy loot boxes in Belgium. You see that the pricing is in euros. If I actually press the button on the side there twice, I would have committed a crime in Belgium, because it is actually against the law to knowingly participate in illegal gambling. And I obviously knew this was illegal gambling, so I didn't press those two buttons, luckily. But anyway, moving on to the second measure that has been adopted in many countries, and this is so-called probability disclosures. You'll see two examples here. On the left, you'll see that this particular game tells you that your probability of obtaining one rare tier hero is 43.7%. On the right, you'll see similar disclosures that are made more specifically about individual items. The one on the left is about categories, and the one on the right is about each individual item. The one on the right is, of course, more detailed. So as to the situation, the difference between China and the UK, comparing what benefits law and what benefits self-regulation has brought, what we found was that in China, the disclosure rate was 95.6%. So nearly every game that contained loot boxes made probability disclosures. Very good. But in the UK, where this was only required by industry self-regulation, only about 2/3 of companies complied, 1/3 didn't. And that's not very good in comparison to what the law can achieve. And this is why I say that industry self-regulation needs to be treated with a degree of skepticism, just because of the conflict of interest issues, right? Because video game companies, of course, profit off of these loot boxes. And if we assume that probability disclosures are helpful, then it would be in a company's interest to implement it poorly or to not implement it at all. And similarly, because the app stores, the publishers, they take a cut of how much of the money is spent on loot boxes, they are also conflicted from enforcing the regulation, just because if it's not there, they should in theory make more money. Now, the problem with probability disclosures is even when a company has complied by making it, we found that many companies didn't do it in a very good way. Now, this is a good example. You see that the probabilities are clearly set out there at the bottom. You see what the percentage chances are. This is where you buy the loot box and you see the chances very clearly. This is good. But you've had other examples where the player had to do more things before they can see the probability disclosure. Now, in this game, the player had to interact with those two dice icons. You see I've circled them. If the player doesn't interact with those, they can't see the probabilities. But in a lot of games, all you have to do is you tap on something like this, and then a pop-up window would appear, and then you can see the probability disclosures. But in this game, just tapping doesn't work. You actually have to use your finger, and you have to hold on onto the screen for the pop-up window on the right to appear. As soon as you let go, it's gone. But the thing is that, of course, that our fingers are, well, the screen is quite small and our fingers are quite big. So if you actually hold your finger over that particular button, you will block out most of the pop-up window. We were only able to see the probability disclosure because I took a screenshot. But if you didn't take a screenshot, I'm not actually sure you can read the probability disclosures just because of the way that it's being implemented by companies. Now, we've also had examples like this one that is just obviously incorrect and inaccurate. It says that for this particular item, the probabilities are 96%, 1.8%, and 1.8%. You'll notice that those three numbers, they don't add up to 100%. We don't know what happens in 0.4% of the time. That's not good. We also had examples where the companies simply disclose that the probability is somewhere between, for example, 0.5% to 2%. That's not good. That's a 4-time difference. In theory, you would be spending 4 times as much money to try to get it, depending on which side of that range the real probability actually is. We've also had examples like this one, where you see how many decimal points there are. For example, for 3,000 gold, the probability of getting them is 0.51480%. Now, that's not very helpful for consumers because it really needs them to properly understand very complicated numerical information. And this is a game, of course, that's suitable for young people to play. Is a child going to be able to understand so many decimal points and such minute probabilities? And this is probably the worst example that we found. The probabilities are disclosed using this mathematical formula. And it actually says, I believe, 1 million divided by the amount of soul stones to the 1.5 power. I don't really know how to compute this, and I don't imagine most players will be able to. So even though probability disclosures have been made, the calculation in some games are so complex that a normal consumer is not going to be able to understand it, even if you tell them, supposedly, this is how it worked. Oh, and of course, there's also this example. Now, this is a so-called social casino game or a simulated casino game. So it tries to replicate what occurs in a casino. Now, in real life, if you throw 3 dice, the probability of all 3 dice landing on the same face, so if you are getting 1, 1, 1 or 6, 6, 6, the probabilities for both of those would, of course, be the same. But in this particular game, they've changed that up. The probability of getting 6, 6, 6 is a lot lower than the probability of getting 1, 1, 1. Now, if we didn't have the probability disclosure, it would be quite reasonable for a player to think that 6, 6, 6 would appear just as often as 1, 1, 1, because that's what happens in real life, but not in this video game, as you can clearly see. This, I suppose, shows that these probability disclosures are quite important in that we can identify these very misleading implementations of these randomized in-game purchases. Now, finally, I turn to this warning label that age rating organizations have implemented in North America and also in Europe. In North America, this is implemented by the ESRB, and in Europe, it's by PEGI. They both look at video games, they moderate the content, and they provide age ratings for them. You'll see examples of what the warning label looks like. It says in-game purchases includes random items. I've put the PEGI label in English at the bottom right. And I've also got the Bulgarian version. This is the one that is supposed to appear on Bulgarian versions of the game. I can't read that, unfortunately, but I hope it says in-game purchases includes random items. And this is what they put onto games with loot boxes. Where can you find it? Two ways. The first is on the physical packaging, and the other is by using the PEGI search tool, which I've shown there at the bottom. But the problem with this particular label is, I'll give you an example. So this is a very popular game, FIFA 23. But the thing is that the label is only on the back of the packaging. So you see that it does not appear on the front, even though the age rating appears on the front. It only appears on the back, which is the second picture there, but it's very small. You got to zoom in all the way there, and then you see that is where it says it. So it's not really that obvious for consumers. If you know what you're looking for, you can find it. But if you don't know what you're looking for, I'm not sure it's prominent enough to warn either players or parents. Alternatively, you can find it on the search tools for both age rating organizations. Again, for the same FIFA 23 game, you'll see that it's being disclosed properly on both platforms. But I've found that with some video games, they have not done the same thing. So this game contains loot boxes, I can tell you that. But the ESRB has somehow decided that they would not like to put the warning label onto that game. And of course, this means that consumers in North America just don't have access to that very important information. So through my study, I found that both age rating organizations, in fact, have made mistakes when they were rating games, likely caused by companies not telling them that their games had loot boxes in. And PEGI took enforcement action, which is good. That's always good to see some sort of accountability. But the problem was that the two companies were fined 5,000 euros each for not telling PEGI that the games contain loot boxes. But one of the games made 480 million euros in the 1 year since its release. And throughout that period, it was not properly attached with the loot box warning. So the fine was 0.001% of the earnings, which is not very good. They, for a very big company, they wouldn't particularly care about that very insignificant amount. So another issue with the implementation of this label is that it's implemented on the Google Play Store, which is good. On the Apple platform, you still can't see this information. You see on the left, that's what appears if you visit the US store, and on the right is what happens when you visit the Danish store. On the left is the ESRB age ratings, and on the right is the PEGI age ratings. What you have to do is you're going to press that little eye icon, and then you get this pop-up window that would appear for you. And then on that pop-up window, it will tell you the label that we've been talking about. But the thing is that I looked at 100 very popular games with loot boxes in them, and I found that 71 of them were not attached with the label, even though this measure has supposedly been implemented onto the Google Play Store. What the age rating organizations have told me is that the Google Play Store hasn't updated to implement this until February 2022, and any games that were rated before February 2022 didn't have to comply. And this is despite nearly all very popular games today were released prior to February 2022. So this is basically saying that any older games, even though they're still very popular, do not need to comply with this particular consumer protection measure, even though it is so very easy to implement. My reaction to that particular response from the ESRB was this particular emoji. It's quite good that by speaking with the age rating organizations, I've managed to get 77 of 84 games attached with the label when they should have it, but didn't have it at the time. But I mentioned this because you see that it's not all 84 that I identify, because we've noticed that some games have decided to implement very, very complicated loot boxes. They involve multiple transactions, and but regardless, some randomization is involved before the real money, turn into some in-game rewards. And the age rating organizations have said that with some of those mechanics, they don't think they're loot boxes, even though randomization is involved. Now, that's a bit of an issue because if the more complicated you make the mechanic, the less it can be regulated, then companies are going to make more and more complicated things that consumers are less likely to understand. If it's a loot box that is shown and advertised as a loot box, players know what they're getting themselves into. But if it's something that involves multiple steps, but nevertheless involves randomization, a player might not understand that they're engaging with something that is potentially very difficult to understand. The PEGI response, or what I thought was the PEGI response, was that this implementation was very poor on the Google Play Store because there are just so many games on the Google Play Store, more than 1 million apparently. But they also said that we don't have that sort of issue with the volume of content on other storefronts. So I went and fact-checked that particular assertion that they've made. And I looked at the Epic Game Store, the Microsoft Store, the Sony Store, and the Nintendo Store. And you see the compliance rates for those stores on this particular table. You'll see that for the Epic Game Store, the compliance rate was actually 7.1%. That's even worse than on the Google Play Store, even though all they had to do was look at 14 video games, and very popular video games indeed. But we do see that with some of the major publishers with those platforms, the compliance rate was higher. So I think it is possible to achieve a good compliance rate with this particular measure, especially when you're not looking at that many games. But nonetheless, the situation is not very satisfactory. You still have plenty of games that have loot boxes in, very popular games that have loot boxes in, that simply do not tell the consumer that they contain loot boxes. We've also had research done by a team based in Australia and New Zealand, where they found that this particular label is not actually understood by players because, of course, it says in-game purchases includes random items. It doesn't talk about loot boxes. It doesn't talk about gacha mechanics. It doesn't use any of the language that a player or a parent might understand. It decided to invent some new language to describe this phenomenon. So really, I don't think it's a surprise that consumers don't understand what it means. And this, of course, challenges whether or not this is an effective measure. Now, I just want to end on the use of European consumer protection law, because, of course, this is something that is unified and harmonized laws across the European Union. It's the same law that's been implemented into each country. And so if one of the countries said that something is required because of European Union consumer protection law, it should similarly be required elsewhere in the European Union. And we've had the Italian and the Dutch regulators and also the UK regulators suggest that, for example, a game must disclose that it contains loot boxes or other forms of in-game purchases because that's required under European Union consumer protection law, or that a game needs to make probability disclosures. I think this might be a way to sort of get companies that operate from Bulgaria. I know that Gameloft, they have an office in Sofia, and they are, of course, implement mobile games. So there are also some things that could be done just based on European Union law. But yes, thanks very much for coming, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I see I've got some questions in the Q&A. I'll get to you shortly. But thanks very much. And if you have got any other questions after this session, feel free to just get in contact with any of those methods. Should I just go through the questions now then? Yep. Okay. So we've got, do we have any research on how loot boxes affect kids' sort of thinking? And not yet, unfortunately. Most of the research has only focused on sort of quite broad look at just problem gambling and loot box purchasing behavior. However, one recent study has come out that interviewed both young people and also their parents to talk about how their experience has been with loot boxes. I don't think it's the sort of psychology or psychiatry evidence that we need at the moment. So that's still an area that we need to look into for sure. Danny Brown asked that if they ban loot boxes in Belgium, is there a chance that something more dangerous shows up there? I'm not sure on the more dangerous, because I feel like because of the way that they regulated anything involving randomization, if that happens, we will be looking at something that doesn't involve randomization. So we're kind of then outside of the realm of gambling. So I can't really seem to imagine something more dangerous. But I do agree with the point that if, for example, a country says that we're going to regulate the most obvious loot boxes, so the one that appear as a box and you buy it and you get random rewards, and they only regulate those. And I've seen some laws drafted in such a way as to say that that is all that they're going after. Then, you know, a company might just implement what I mentioned earlier about more and more complex loot boxes, and I would suggest those are more dangerous than a loot box that is obviously advertised as a loot box because of just how complex they are. So yeah, I get what you mean, that if you go after it, something more dangerous might show up. But I think this is a matter that could be addressed by having good regulation that are drafted so that any in-game purchases involving any sort of randomization will be captured. And I know we've had players say that with some of the games that decided to no longer implement loot boxes, they now put in like battle pass systems or season pass systems where there's no randomization involved. Instead, the player sort of pays a subscription, a monthly subscription, let's say, and then they have to keep playing the game in order to obtain more and more rewards. That sort of replaced loot boxes in some games. Some players seem to dislike those more than they dislike loot boxes, but in terms of that randomization, that sort of gambling harm aspect, I don't think, at least to me, they are more harmful than loot boxes necessarily. But those are also interesting things, and we should look into whether they might be harmful. It's being suggested that because the players sort of spend money to buy something, but they didn't actually get those items, they actually have to spend, say, 40 hours playing the game before they got them. This might be a very good way to sort of get people to feel like that they are obliged to keep playing the game just so they get what they've already bought in that sense. We have a question from Melina. Is the digitalization makes it easier for young people that play? I'll just have a quick read and yes, sort of a question about whether video games might generally, irrespective, I believe, of loot boxes, might be developing gambling behaviors in children. I don't think that is the case, and if that is the case, it would only, I believe, occur with a very small minority of people. I generally see video games as a positive element. It is enjoyed by so many people, and I would say a lot more people are able to engage with video games safely than can people engage with traditional gambling safely. So I suppose in theory this might occur with some people, but I don't think this is a concern that's really justified on the evidence that we have at the moment. But of course, you know, with the WHO ICD definition of video game addiction or online gaming addiction, it is just the gambling addiction criteria, but with the gambling replaced with online video gaming. Given how similar the diagnostic criteria are, it's possible that you can find correlations between those two, but that might be because of the definition rather than necessarily of the two behaviors sharing some similarity. But I realize I'm probably more cynical about video game addiction than other researchers might be, so that might not be the most balanced answer in the world. Sorry about that. Right, so we have a question. Do games for the youngest audience, so less than 7 years old, offer loot boxes? Yes, they do. So on the Apple App Store, we have the 4+ age rating, which suggests that it's suitable for anyone aged 4 or above. And I believe the prevalence rate of loot boxes is about 60% of those games have loot boxes in, at least. So yes, they are very much present in games deemed suitable for young children. PEGI has a PEGI 3 rating, which says that it's suitable for absolutely everyone. And again, games with the loot boxes are attached with that particular age rating. This is because whether or not a game contains loot boxes, it is not a criterion that is considered as part of the age rating decision. The age rating decision is made on the basis of how much violence, how much sexualized content, etc. are in the video game. Whether or not the game has loot boxes is not relevant, which is why it appears in games deemed very suitable for young children. And I think what's more concerning perhaps is that we see them implemented in video games that are not just deemed suitable for young people, but are obviously designed to target young people. So obviously a children's game with loot boxes in, that's more concerning. However, it's quite interesting, and I feel like I should mention that in Germany, they amended their media law recently, and it is now required for the German video game age rating organization to take into account whether or not a game has loot boxes in when giving an age rating. So they have to think about it. And quite interesting that the football game by EA that used to be rated in Germany as suitable for everyone, but I believe now it's either 12 plus or 16 plus. So that has changed, and you can see that if we do say to age rating organizations that they must account for loot box presence when making age rating decisions, that will have an impact on what happens. So that is a potential strategy to regulating it, although I'm not sure I fully agree, because the underlying game is suitable for young people. And I feel like by giving it a much higher age rating, you might be preventing some young people from being able to play that game. I believe what is more suitable is probably to force companies to release 2 different versions of the same game, one with and one without loot boxes, because this ensures that young people will still have access to video games. It doesn't mean that companies would just decide to abandon the sort of young children market just so that they can comply with the law. How long usually does it take for governments to start regulating loot boxes? Well, the issue sort of has been, I think, in the public debate, at least in the US and in the UK, since I would say about 2017, 2018. So that's been about, what, 6 years now? And we haven't seen anything. And I don't think we will actually see anything in either the US or the UK. It just depends on really how fast a law can potentially pass in a certain country, right? In Korea, when they wanted to require probability disclosures, I think it took about a year or 2 before something was brought in. It just depends on, I think, how much a country really cares and really how much the ruling government cares about the particular issue. If they want to do something, they very much can very quickly, but if they don't, they can drag on for years, and I think that's what we will see in most countries. Nothing will happen to it, unfortunately. We've got, do video game makers use the same design as the makers of slot games? I believe so. You remember the video that I showed you at the start? You know, there were those very exciting music, very exciting visual effects, explosions going absolutely everywhere. I think that is an element that we know works for slot machines, and so they're now implemented into these video game loot boxes. Whether or not they work, we don't know, but I feel like it's one of those things where it's very cheap for the companies to implement it, and it's not going to be bad for them to implement it, so they just put it in whether or not it works. And of course, I also mentioned that with some of the near-miss effects, I believe near-miss effects are now really not allowed with slot machines. But with loot boxes, they very much appear to exist. You know, you get here's a very good result, and they will show you, oh, you nearly got a very good result, but no, you actually didn't. That sort of near miss thing. They do occur with loot boxes, yes. Another question from Danny. Danny says, what is next after loot boxes? Do selling NFTs in video games going to have the same effect as loot boxes? Well, Danny, so if a video game actually sells loot boxes with NFTs in them, that is illegal gambling in pretty much every country in the world. I'm not sure whether the regulators will enforce the law as such, but that would be what the law says, because an NFT, by definition, is something that is supposed to be worth real money and can be transferred between people, right? So just the but just the inclusion of NFTs inside the video games, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be harmful in the same way as loot boxes, because that's not necessarily going to involve the sort of gambling related harms. But of course, we have seen bad things happen with NFT games in the Philippines, for example, where people have sort of it's just broadly more about I suppose inequalities across the world, where in the Philippines the minimum wage or the money that someone can earn is so low that it actually makes sense for them to play a game with NFTs because they can make more money doing that than they can doing work in the Philippines. And that, of course, led to harm for people because they invested in these NFT characters for video games, and then the market crashed, and now they've lost out on money, right? But I think it's different harms. I've also heard suggestions of people saying that just investing in cryptocurrencies and investing in NFTs, both of those might just be a gambling activity, just like short-term trading on the stock market, because it is so randomized that any sort of skill that someone might have might just be an illusion of control rather than actual control over the results. Right, so we've got a question from Michael. It's quite long, so I'm just gonna read it very quickly. And I'll see what I have to say about it. Yes, so Michal asked me a question about the loot boxes in two video games, them being Counter-Strike Global Offensive and the other being Team Fortress 2, and whether or not they constitute gambling within the meaning of the law. Michal, yes, both of those loot boxes are, in my opinion, illegal gambling in most countries. I've said as much in publications, but the thing is that the regulators are not enforcing the law, even though I've told them. But that's just the unfortunate situation. You are right, because with those loot boxes, the players spend real money to buy them. The rewards are, of course, randomized, and what you can get, you can transfer to other players. You can trade it into money that you can spend on the Steam platform, as Michal has said, and you can also use that money to buy physical products from Steam. So you can get a VR headset. And of course, if you buy the VR headset, you don't open it, you just sell it to someone. You turned that loot box reward into a VR headset and then into real money. So yes, that is illegal gambling because you've satisfied all the elements. But unfortunately, the regulators are just not enforcing the law. So unfortunately, that's just how it is, Michal. But yes, it is illegal gambling. Right, I think that's all the questions that I've got.
I think, yes, that's all the questions. Leon, thank you so much that you have a part in our webinar, and hope to see you again. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Thanks for coming.
You too. Thank you. Bye.